I have a confession. I am a really lazy writer who procrastinates a lot. I know. Lots of people say you gotta just get your butt in that chair and write, gotta be disciplined. I just find that really hard. And so, what I'd rather do is motivate myself better to write a lot than to struggle with my own lazy impulses to force myself to write. And honestly, I think when I do that, my writing is better because I'm excited to write. Happy October, fellow writers. October, as many of you know, is also called Preptober. I've actually never called it that. I have another confession. I know that writers are generally really excited about Nanowrimo, and I think that's great. I have a love-hate relationship with Nanowrimo. On the one hand, I love it because there's this great sense of community energy and lots of people join in, and there's a lot of events that happen around Nano virtually as well as in person. And in general, there's just a lot of goodwill and cheer and community excitement around Nano, which I personally, as somebody who needs motivation to write, find very motivating, and it kind of sustains me. I can ride that wave. On the other hand, I really dislike competition. The idea that you can win Nano or lose Nano doesn't make me feel motivated. And there's been lots of times when I've written a lot for Nano but didn't make the 50K and kind of ended up feeling bad about my writing and myself and my progress, even though I had no rational reason to be. I had no reason to actually feel bad about it. That said, I am going to do Nanowrimo this year. This will be, I think, the 10th year that I've officially done it. I did it with a project. I think I finished 50K that year. Over the years, when I participated, I've taken Nano to be different things. And of course, I think that's one of the great things about Nano is that it's highly flexible and you can set different goals for yourself. You can even do something like a short story challenge during Nanowrimo if you want. Again, for me, the primary benefit of Nanowrimo is feeling this collective energy around writing, which you can harness to whatever goal you want. This year, though, I'm going to go ahead and do the good classic Nanowrimo goal of writing 50,000 words on a long-form piece, a novel. Heck, I'll be happy with 30,000 words. I mean, This is my Preptober for pantsers who are also procrastinators like me. You can think of it as kind of the anti-plan or the anti-organization plan. So what do I mean by pantser? I find that I just don't really write to outlines very well. I have tried. I have lots of writer friends who love outlines, and there's something about outlines that really appeals to me because it feels like, oh, this is great. I get to create a roadmap for my novel and where I'm going. And so I've tried a lot to come up with outlines. It never really works, and I don't find it a super creative or motivating activity. And I feel like for me personally, that time and energy in creating an outline is probably just better spent working on other things like the novel itself. The other thing about me is that I don't really do a zero draft. And I think in the beginning when I did Nano, the whole idea is just vomit out a draft. Just put the words out. Doesn't matter if they're good words or it doesn't matter if the story makes sense. Just get it, word count. And I just really lose motivation really quickly when I do that. My first drafts tend to be pretty polished and I don't want to say structurally sound because they're definitely not, especially when I get to the middle and the end of my stories. But the first act tends to be pretty well structured, or at least structured enough to make me happy. And the thing is, I've learned that if I just try to vomit out a draft, I just get demotivated. It's demoralizing to me. I need to feel good about the words that I've written, and I need to feel that the language of the story is working. And this is something that I discovered about me only fairly recently, like in the last year and a half, couple years or so. I would say that for me, the single biggest factor in whether or not I finish a novel is if I can sustain my excitement about being in the story world. I need to feel immersed in the story world and feel like I understand it and I want to be there and want to explore it. And that to me is the thing that keeps me writing and keeps me motivated. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, is how do you plan in October to set yourself up so that you can sustain that mood. And that's why language for me is such a big part of that, because I'm trying to sustain the feeling of this dream, this world that I've created. And if I don't have the language there, then that spell is broken for me and I find it really, really difficult to get back into it. Again, this is totally me. If outlines work for you, if planning and workbooks and these other kinds of Preptober activities work for you, do those things, try those things. I wish they worked for me because it looks really fun and I love Excel spreadsheets and I love planning and I love stuff like that. It's just not working for me right now. Maybe someday they will and I'll try it again and it'll suddenly magically work and that would be awesome. This year, I'm going to be all about sustaining that mood and keeping my motivation going. So step one is pick a project to work on. Even for an anti-planner procrastinator like me, I think this is kind of important, although I have dived into Nanowrimo in the past without a project and that's been okay. I kind of discovered it along the way. But this year I'm going to have a project and I have a few in mind that I'm still deciding between. And I'll probably make that decision in like the last week. Did I mention I'm a procrastinator? So the last week of October, I'll probably have decided. If you don't have a project in mind, then I suggest that you go through some old ideas that you have. If you've seen my other video about how to write SFF for absolute beginners, which I'll link to in the description box below, then one of the suggestions that I have is to write down ideas all the time. And I also tried a challenge this past month in September where I wrote down ideas every day for 2 weeks. And I'll have a video about that coming up next week and you can see how that went. But I generated a lot of ideas in 2 weeks. And one of my goals is to go through those ideas and sift through them and see if there's anything that speaks to me. One thing that I learned from Henry Lien when he taught a class about creativity and getting ideas is he said, take 2 old ideas and see if you can mash them together in an interesting way. And this is such a genius idea. Take an idea for maybe some character and a conflict and then take some other story that you've kind of vaguely thought about and see if you can't work them together somehow and create something entirely new and different. So for example, I have this old novel that I finished years ago that I'm not super excited about. It's fine. It's a fine novel. It's an MG, middle grade novel. It's about a girl who is searching for her brother and that brings her into conflict with the fantasy police, basically, and she has to fight the system. I really like the characters. I really like the world. The story just lacks a little pizzazz, spark, I guess. So I finished it and I even got beta readers for it and then I just sort of shelved it and I wasn't sure what to do with it. After taking Henry Lien's class, I mashed it up with another story idea I had about these giant fantasy mechs that are built out of bone and bamboo. And I thought, oh, that's kind of cool. So maybe now the reason that the girl is searching for her brother is because he's been kidnapped in order to pilot one of these bamboo bone mechs. And I thought, okay, that has a little more spark to it, a little more interest for me personally. So I'm excited to go back to that story, for example. I don't know yet if I will for this nano, but that's something you can do. If you haven't got any ideas written down or you hate all of them and you're not inspired by any of them, then maybe carve out some time to brainstorm some new ideas. Here are a couple of easy ways to get started doing that. One is to think of a character, and maybe this is a character that's brand new to you or a character that you already have. And ways to come up with characters are, I like to just make lists of characters and I'll start with a character role or job, and then I will attach an adjective to that role or job, And I like the adjective to have a little bit of what Maureen McHugh, my partner at Story Kitchen, calls attitude, a little bit of spice. I like the adjective and the noun to have a little bit of conflict with each other or a little tension with each other when they kind of bounce off of each other. So maybe something like a gregarious monk. I think monks are kind of interesting, and I tend to think of monks as being a little bit remote. They are cloistered. They might maybe live by themselves, but then they're also gregarious. They're outgoing, they're extroverted, they're friendly, they like to talk. And so maybe this monk is somebody who lives alone or in a small community, but is desperate for friendship and friends. And that creates a little bit of an interesting conflict and tension that I can maybe play with. So I'll go through and generate a list of like 5, 6, 10 of these, and then start putting them together, put them against each other. So my gregarious monk might meet a depressed librarian, and then I'll think, okay, what could these two have to talk about? Are they in conflict? Are they teaming up together? And once I start doing that exercise, I can start thinking about what is the worst thing that could happen to one of these characters and how do they react? And that'll often give me some traction in some sort of idea, some sort of central conflict that I can then run with. And at that point, you're kind of done. Remember, this is the lazy writer's guide. I'm not asking you to outline it or do anything, just something that makes your brain go, ooh, that's interesting. I want to explore that a little bit more. I want to get to know these characters. That's all you're looking for at this stage. Another thing that's been really helpful for me is to think of retellings remixed. Take some classic story or a fairy tale. Obviously, fairy tales are very popular for this, but you can take any kind of classic story, well-known story, and start playing with it. Change the protagonist, change the goals, change the setup, change the outcome, change genders, sexualities, identities, and see if there's something there that really sparks your interest. A related thing that I love to do, because I think it's really fun, is to create these Hollywood-style comps, and just generate like 10 of these. Don't judge, just write them down. For example, I don't know, Pride and Prejudice meets Pacific Rim. I have no idea what that story would be, but it kind of interests me. I love Pride and Prejudice. I love Pacific Rim. And then at that point, I might start playing around with that. Okay, what could this story be about if I'm going to comp it like that? And I kind of backwards engineer the story from the comp. And whether or not the final story ends up being anything like the comps, that's totally fine, right? You're just looking for some sparks, something to get you motivated and going and excited so that you can dive in November. And then my final tip about generating new ideas is to write some log lines. When character X discovers shocking fact Y, she must take some action before something awful happens. That's kind of the formula of many log lines. So you can just look up formulas of log lines or look up a bunch of log lines for existing media, including movies, and play around with them. Maybe plug in some of the characters that you generated. When the gregarious monk is left on his own on a mountaintop with no food, he must make friends with the birds to survive. I don't know, that one was terrible. I'm sorry, I'm really bad at doing this on the fly. But you get the idea. Find the formula, start plugging in some various scenarios, and see if anything fun comes out that you think, yeah, okay, I can run with this. The second thing is about the mood. As I mentioned at the very beginning of this video, for me, motivation to write and to sustain writing for an entire month at the pace that Nano demands, or at close to the pace, because I'm not going to pressure myself to keep up with the Nano official goals. It requires me to sustain the mood, to stay in the story world, and to stay embedded in, I guess, the story's POV, if that makes sense. Some of what I do during this time too is create mood enhancers, things that will help me get into and stay into the mood and remind me of what the story is really about. For me, the story starts out as being about a feeling. Like I have to feel what the story is, or else it's really hard for me to write it. And so that comes for me along a couple of different axes. The first I would say is language. So this is where I like to do something like my word generation exercise, which I will link to in the description box below, but it's basically an exercise where I just kind of come up with words and play with them. It can be really helpful for me to define some sort of, not exactly as formal as a style guide, but a vocabulary for the novel that I want to write. What kinds of words is it going to use? What's the diction? What's the tone? And I might do a little bit of free writing around that. If it's in first person especially, I might do a little bit of free writing to get into the character voice a little. But every story has a voice, right? Even if it's not in first person, it still has a mood, a tone, a perspective, a voice. I like to think of words that will help me get to that voice. If I'm writing a horror novel, I'm actually writing a horror short story now, but a lot of my words are describing the gloom, the darkness, the dread, and I just write those words down and just kind of have them handy so that when I'm feeling like I'm getting pulled out of the story mood, I can help get myself back in by telling me what those words are. The other thing that I like to do is collect media that reminds me of the story's voice, tone, mood, or imagery. And that could include things like creating a mood board of visual inspiration. It can be movies and books and media that are similar to my story in terms of their attitude, their mood. What kind of visual language am I referencing when I am trying to write this story? I sometimes like to cast my characters with actors or other characters. I haven't yet really played a lot with making playlists, but I know a lot of people do, and that helps a lot. And for the ghost story, I actually started listening to a lot of kind of gothic romantic music playlists, and that put me into the mood. Something that my sister, who's also a writer, suggested that I tried doing, and I love this idea, is pick out a theme song for your novel, and also maybe theme songs for your major characters. What's their theme song? I think that's awesome. So if you're musically minded and that sparks your creativity, then that's something that you can do this month. I also like to take this month in October to do a deep dive into the books that are similar to my book. And it's not that I'm necessarily looking for ways to imitate these books, but it's more to get myself in the mood of my story. I'll download a bunch of samples of books on my Kindle, of books that I think are similar, and the ones that I feel hooked by, I will read. Yeah, it's all just kind of helping me figure out what the voice of my story is and how to get into it and be inspired and stay in it. The next set of tips I have for you are extremely practical tips. And this is something that I learned from a writer, Valerie Valdez, who does a whole wonderful lecture on how to outline, which I've taken her Clarion West class on how to outline, and it taught me so much. Even though I don't outline, I really admire people who do. And I really enjoy learning about how other people work. It's one of the things that I love. I think I'm partly motivated by just pedagogy and understanding how people learn and how people create. Anyway, small digression aside, Valerie made the super important point that there are some practical aspects to prepping for nanos. I am the primary food prep person in my household, and that actually takes up a lot of time, right? Like it takes time to think of what you're going to make, to collect the ingredients, to actually make it. Not only does it take up time, but for me, it takes a little mental energy. About 4 p.m. or even earlier sometimes, a little voice in the back of my head will start asking, what's for dinner? What am I going to make? And I'll start kind of doing a mental inventory of what's in the refrigerator. That's all very distracting and takes you out of the mood of the story, takes you out of what you were doing, out of the flow. This month is a good month to think about what can I do to ease that burden. And maybe that means just brainstorming a few simple meal ideas that you can throw together. Maybe it means doing some prep. I know that I am lazy lazy and a procrastinator, so I am not going to be one of those people who does meal prep and has little neat frozen packages of food ready to go, but I might buy some commercial frozen foods to get me through some of the more busy days. I might also plan to do takeout more frequently than we currently do. And then also just cooking in batches when I do cook. That's something that I try to do anyway, but being a little more conscious of doing that every time I think can be really helpful. And then just having easy to make snacks on hand. For example, in our house, we don't typically do a lot of like sandwiches for whatever reason. I don't know why. I love sandwiches. We just haven't been doing that. But for Nanowrimo, for November, I think it'll be a good idea to have some bread on hand with a bunch of sandwich fixings. And then that way it's like a quick, easy meal for lunch or dinner. I also make oatmeal in batches for the morning. I'll make one big pot of oatmeal, and then that will be the meal for 5 or 6 days. November can also be full of obligations, especially social and family obligations. What I suggest that you do is tell people that you're doing this Nanowrimo. Even if they're not writers and they've never heard of Nanowrimo, they'll understand if you say, hey, I'm working on a novel this month, so I'm not going to be available. You can clear your social calendar. You can do what you can to mitigate asks of you. Say no to things. If there are conferences or events that are happening in November, cancel going to those and prioritize your writing or not. You know, my whole thing is about not planning too hard and also to do what keeps you motivated. So if you think that going to a writing conference is going to motivate you, you're going to come back refreshed and inspired from seeing all these writers at this conference, then go. But for me, part of being able to sustain the mood is about having long stretches of time when I'm basically focused kind of only on my story. Of course, there's work and, chores and all other stuff that you have to do while you're writing. But trying to minimize those kinds of distractions that create a little too much noise in my brain so that I can sustain that story world and that mood for as long as possible has been really important for me. Going along with this idea of clearing your calendar, I found it super, super helpful to set up some co-writing sessions. You can tell some of your friends, or you can tell Nanowrimo forums or groups that you're doing this and see if anybody has already set up some co-writing sessions or set some up yourself. And these are really easy to do. You can do them over Discord, over voice chat, over the video chat in Discord. You can use Google Meet. I like to use Zoom, and I'll just set up a Zoom link and say, hey, we're all going to write from 8:30 a.m. till 10:30 a.m. Come if you want to write. We're not here to chat. We're just going to write. And or doing writing sprints. Discord has a bot that will do writing sprints for you. And just schedule those ahead of time so that there's a little bit of accountability. I know, I'm lazy and I'm a procrastinator, which is why I need to schedule these ahead of time and have accountability, because I will be motivated to show up and do it if I know that 3 other people are going to be there showing up and doing it. That'll make me want to do it. That'll make me excited to do it for me personally. Nanowrimo.org is a great place to find community. There's lots of event organizers. There's lots of local events, and as well as national and international events online now. Check those out and spend this month kind of poking around and seeing if you can find a couple of nano buddies that you can write with, because that will really help with the motivation. At least it does for me. Okay, I think that's it. This has been Preptober. Why is that so hard to say? Preptober for pantsers who are also procrastinators. Your anti-planning plan for getting through October and having a really good Nanowrimo in November. So I hope this was helpful for you. Happy writing.